Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull movie review. So, as you've probably already guessed, because this movie is over 10 years old now, this is one of my scripted reviews. Scripted reviews, it's the name I use for when I take one of my old reviews from my blog and read through it and try and make a YouTube video out of it for whatever it may or may not be worth. So you remember this movie was a big deal when it came out. Big deal in the sense of a lot of people were complaining about how it had ruined the Indiana Jones franchise and how it had ruined their childhoods. And it all seems like so long ago now, but obviously if you've been paying attention to the internet, we've had this same debate repeated over and over again with different franchises. So, a bit of personal background on this. Number one, I'm a child of the 1980s, so I have tons of nostalgia for Indiana Jones and the Indiana Jones franchise, which is a subject perhaps I will fully explain later in a different post. I don't want to get too bogged down into that. Secondly, for this movie, I was living out in the Japanese countryside when this came out. At that time, theatrical movies in Japan got a delayed release. I think they've stopped doing that now because, you know, the internet makes it hard to do this. But back in the day, things used to get, delayed by 3, 4, 6 months before they hit the theaters in Japan. Plus, I was living in a small town that didn't have any theaters. So by the time this hit my video rental store in Japan, I had time to read everyone else's reviews about it and watch everyone else's YouTube videos about it. And I already knew that people were really upset and didn't like this movie before I saw it. I thought it was fine. I thought the action sequences were good. I thought they were on par with the original trilogy. Harrison Ford is obviously a lot older now, and there have been a lot of jokes on the internet or, people concerned that he wouldn't be able to do the stunts, but I thought he did fine. I don't know, maybe it was some stunt doubles or movie magic or clever editing or whatever it was. Who knows, maybe it was Harrison Ford himself. I thought the action sequences were fine. I liked the adventures in the jungle. I thought they were everything that an Indiana Jones movie should be. The search for the lost cities of gold, the man-eating ants, going over the waterfalls, the Russian spies, the spy and counter-spy stuff. It was all great fun. It was another Indiana Jones film, which I guess was what I wanted. The only complaint, really, well, there are a few complaints, but I guess maybe the big one, is that it didn't really feel like it was breaking new ground. Or to be more specific, just about every scene in this movie was calling back to a scene from the original trilogy. So, you were watching this action scene and you're like, oh, right, this is exactly like that other action scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Or this is exactly like that other scene in The Last Crusade. Like everything, even as far as some of the endings to the action scenes or like the punchlines, were very reminiscent of everything Indiana Jones has done before. I still enjoyed it. It was still fun to see it done again in a slightly different setting with, the punches being thrown in a slightly different order. I don't know. I know this movie played it really safe. But I'm going to borrow from Roger Ebert. Roger Ebert said of this movie, quote, same old. Yes, but that's what I want it to be. And I agree. Same old, but yeah, that's essentially what I wanted. Harrison Ford was doing the usual Harrison Ford bit. Harrison Ford's a national treasure. He's got this perfect dry wit, sarcastic humor, which was great in the original trilogy, and I thought he was as good as ever doing it here. Now, the big fan complaints, and I'm sure you're already aware of this, was that it involved aliens, and a lot of fans thought that Indiana Jones movie shouldn't involve aliens, and the nuke the fridge scene. I'll deal with the nuke the fridge scene first because it's the easiest one to deal with. Yeah, that wasn't great. I mean, you know, like, it didn't ruin the whole movie for me. I got past it, but it was a little bit too much. You know, with these Indiana Jones movies, or I guess with action movies in general, you do have to suspend a lot of disbelief because a lot of the stuff in this movie couldn't have happened in real life. But the filmmakers have to meet you halfway with this. You can't be working too hard to suspend your disbelief. If at any time you get brought completely out of the movie and you have to say to yourself, okay, that was really ridiculous, then it's a misstep. And this was a misstep, but I survived. I saw it. I thought, okay, it's a little bit out of the top, and then I forgave it, and I got back into the movie. It didn't ruin it for me. Some other people have already pointed out that Indiana Jones has already kind of gone above and beyond the suspension of disbelief in previous movies. For example, in that movie in the Temple of Doom where they jumped out of the airplane without any parachute and just sailed down on the raft and landed on the mountain. You know, in any real life scenario, I think they would all have had their bones broken upon impact, but you know, that never bothered me as a kid. Maybe if I had seen that movie for the first time as an adult, it would have been different. Point is, as a fan, you have to be willing to forgive stuff now and then. I'm not wild about that nuke the fridge scene, but you know, some people on the internet have just gone on and on and on about how awful that scene was. And at a certain point, you just have to say, okay, it wasn't great. I'm going to move on with my life. The other thing people didn't like is the aliens. Now, there's a bit of a behind-the-scenes story to this aliens thing, in that apparently George Lucas wanted aliens to be the bad guy in the story, or wanted it to have something to do with aliens. And Steven Spielberg talked him out of it, and I think Steven Spielberg was probably right to talk him out of it. And yet, at the same time, I think George Lucas had half a point. I could kind of see where he was coming from. So George Lucas's argument, or what George Lucas wanted, was he figured that Indiana Jones was based on the pulp fiction of the 1930s. Now, everyone's 20 years older at this point, and, you know, like in Harrison Ford's case, visibly 20 years older. So you can't keep it in the 1930s anymore. You have to move the storyline 20 years ahead to the 1950s. And in the 1950s, what was a big science fiction thing, or pulp fiction thing? It was space aliens. And if you go through and you look at what was happening to the pulp fiction of the 1930s, you know, Tarzan and Dick Tracy and Little Orphan Annie, they all had a space alien phase in the 1950s and 60s. Look this up. They all did. So you can easily imagine that if Indiana Jones had been a pulp fiction character in the 1930s, like in real time, he probably would have had a space alien phase in the 1950s or 60s, as, you know, the people who were writing him were trying to make him appeal to the new generation. So you know, on the one hand, I do have to admit that it probably wouldn't have jived right with the tone of Indiana Jones. On the other hand, I can see where George Lucas was coming from. There is a certain degree of logical sense to this. If you say that Indiana Jones was originally designed to be a homage to the pulp fiction serials of the 1930s, he probably would have had a space alien period if they had kept him going through the 1950s. So they made a compromise, which was that they weren't really space aliens as we think of like UFOs. They were interdimensional beings. And for some fans, that was still a little bit beyond the pale. Some fans were like, oh, that's still aliens of any kind shouldn't be in an Indiana Jones movie. I don't know, like if you think about it, there have already been a number of ridiculous stuff in the Indiana Jones movies, right? I mean, the first one was the whole Ark of the Covenant, and like that was... But then the second one, right? The Temple of Doom, you had all kinds of ridiculous stuff being in the Temple of Doom. Now, I guess you could argue that that was mythic. And mythic stuff is different than science fiction stuff. But I don't know. You know, the Temple of Doom really got pretty ridiculous with the amount of magic stuff that was going on there. So then, I don't know. You see where this is going, right? It gets a little bit ridiculous to complain about what could and could not be in an Indiana Jones movie when we've already had movies like Temple of Doom. Furthermore, you know, I think when Lucas and Spielberg were originally making this franchise back in the early 80s, they were paying homage to the jungle movie serial adventures that had been from the 1930s. And they were trying to update it for the modern era, but they were putting all these references to Pulp Fiction from the past eras. And what a lot of fun that must have been for them. I mean, boy, would I have liked to get on the ground floor of that. Well, actually, I wouldn't, because why mess with it? They already did the perfect job. But it just must have been a lot of fun to go through and pick out all these things from old Pulp Fiction and try and make them work for a modern audience. And there were really no rules about you can have this in an Indiana Jones movie, you can't have that. Now, of course, fans, people my age, have grown up with these movies and feel an ownership of it. And now people my age are saying, no, you can't do this in an Indiana Jones movie. So what's the result of that? Well, we get an Indiana Jones movie in which every scene is reminiscent of a scene before, which is what I was talking about earlier. So that if you're going to get too restrictive about what you can and can't do with an Indiana Jones movie, then you're going to have a movie like this, which is playing it completely safe. So yeah, that's the trade-off. At the time this movie came out, and at the time I wrote up my original review 10 years ago, people thought that Indiana Jones 5 was just right around the corner. And I even mentioned in my original review something to the effect of, okay, so this movie just played it safe, it was just a replay of all of Indiana Jones' greatest hits. Whatever, the next movie will hopefully be something more interesting. And then the next movie never happened, although apparently they're still working on it. I don't know what the holdup was, some behind-the-scenes story, or I don't know. But they're still talking about it, so maybe we will still get that Indiana Jones 5 after all. And if we ever do, I'll be back with my review of that.